Good morning. I'm just going to continue my series about the last World Chess Championship between Ding Liren and Dominaju Gukesh, known as Ding and Gukesh. Ding is the reigning world champion when this game is played, and Gukesh is the challenger. Ding won the first game, brilliant French defence, won the first game with the white pieces, and the second game was a draw. There were possible chances to both players, but I think the nervousness of both players really began to show in the second game. This is the third game, and here Gukesh has the white pieces and Ding has the black pieces. Let's see what happens. d4, a normal queen's pawn opening. Knight f6, I often say the most flexible reply to d4. It's a kind of wait and see move. This is called here the knight's variation. If the pawn had come to e6, then it would be the anti-Nimzo, because it makes it not as attractive to play bishop here check. So d4, d5, queen's pawn symmetrical variation, because these pieces are symmetrical, and he's threatening to play a completely symmetrical Tarrasch defense. But he plays e6, the queen's gambit declined, and Gukesh takes. This is a good and often used method in the queen's gambit decline, is to take the pawn on d5, the so-called exchange variation, and then play bishop to g5, for example, the quiet positional line. Yeah, so he takes the pawn back. Of course, he's going to regain his pawn, and the knight develops. Nothing wrong with development. The bishop g5 isn't the only possible move. Knight c3 is a perfectly good move. Pawn comes to c6, so we're looking at some kind of Slav structure. This so-called Carlsbad structure is a common thing in the this missing pawn is part of the Carlsbad, is a common thing in Slav structures, and so this is a Slav or a Carlsbad structure. So the queen comes to c2. Yeah, why not get the queen out early, so that he's toying with the idea of a quick development with the bishop and castling long. He's not going to, but black has to take account of that possibility. So he plays g6. This is partly to develop his bishop to g7, like a normal King's Indian, but partly to protect the square f5, so that the bishop can come here and threaten the queen. It couldn't do that without the pawn. So it seems a bit pointless to be playing h3 when you know the bishop is coming here anyway, but the idea is that after the queen moves, you'll then be in a position to play g4 and chase away that bishop. So he plays f5 as advertised, and the queen comes to b3. The queen comes to b6. My limited understanding of this position is that the player who blinks first, who takes the queen, gets a disadvantage. Yeah. So that's my limited understanding. But Ding has a plan here. Doesn't work, but he has a plan. So Gukesh plays to g4, attacking the bishop. He doesn't want to give up that lovely square for his bishop. He doesn't want to have to retreat with his bishop. So he takes the queen. And now he plays bishop to c2. Great, he's attacking the pawn. Gukesh needs to defend that pawn. Like all good chess players, he defends with development. How does that defend the pawn on b3, I hear you asking? It's quite clever, but also quite simple. If black was now to take the pawn on b3, Gukesh would take the knight on b8 with the bishop, must be taken back with the rook, and then the rook on a2 would win this pawn. And it's just a pawn for a pawn, an exchange of prisoners, as we say in chess parlance. So he doesn't want to go for that. So he plays h5, threatening to take the pawn. He can't take back because the rook would take the rook, winning. So Gukesh plays rook to g1. Pawn's taken and the pawn's taken. This cuts off the bishop from this square, which creates an idea for Gukesh. Sorry. So the knight comes to b7, so that the idea of taking the pawn and winning the pawn isn't any longer possible. So the knight comes to d2, and it doesn't just defend the pawn on b3. It cuts off this square from the bishop. So the bishop can't go here, can't go here, can't go here, can't go here, and can't take this pawn. The bishop is in a bit of trouble. So the rook comes to g8, so that he's in a position to push the pawn, excuse me, to g5, so that if Gukesh now goes ahead and plays rook to c1, then pawn c5 comes, which not only attacks the bishop, but opens up a square, opens up this diagonal for the bishop to retreat on. So of course he doesn't let that happen, and he plays g5, attacking the knight. Alright, the knight now has, the bishop now has this square, but that's all it is. I looked at if it was possible to play rook c1 there, rather than the move that was played, and it was. Computer says it's the best move, so it was a nice little surprise for me that I thought, why doesn't he just play rook to c1 now? It doesn't win him anything, but you know, it's the best move. So he plays h5, and the bishop retreats. And the rook comes to h8, so that he's threatening the bishop on h2. Pawn comes to f3 to cut this square off for the bishop. Knight comes to g7, so that the rook attacks the bishop on g3. Nope. Bishop comes to g3, and the rook comes to h5, attacking the pawn on g5. He cuts off the square for the rook, for the bishop, thinking, yeah, well, if you want to take that, I'm just going to play rook here anyway and win your bishop. So the pawn gets taken, and it gets taken back. And the knight comes, threatening the pawn on g5, and possibly more importantly, the pawn on d4, which would then support the bishop. The rook threatens the bishop, and the knight takes the pawn and supports the bishop, and also supports the escape here. Has he gone wrong? No, he hasn't. Because he plays bishop to f2, and he's threatening the knight. If he takes the pawn with the bishop, the knight falls. If he takes with the knight, then the rook falls. So, you know, the bishop is still trapped. So bishop comes to g7, so that if he takes with the bishop, then it will be check. When Ding takes back with the bishop, he's threatening the rook, and then it won't do him any good that he's threatening the bishop. So he retreats with the knight. Again, he's still holding these squares, and now he's threatening to play knight takes knight, and then rook takes bishop. So there's no escape for the bishop, so he takes a pawn, best he can get for his bishop. So he takes a pawn. Now, as it stands, he's 2 pawns for his bishop. So that's not a bad deal. It's near to being survivable, this, but unfortunately not quite. He takes with the king to get the king in a more active position. The knight comes threatening check here, and the knight covers the check. the knight is pinned so that he isn't any longer covering this check, and the king comes to e2 so that the knight isn't any longer pinned, and so that f3 isn't so forward. Rook comes to h2 so that the bishop, which is the only defender of the knight, is pinned so that he can play rook takes knight, and the bishop can't take back because it's pinned. Oh, sorry, wrong button. So he breaks the pin with bishop to g2. a6, trying to start some queenside expansions, probably not going to help him. This takes away this square for the knight. Rook comes to d7, and the rooks support one another. This is to support, so the rooks support one another, but so that the rook can come here, supporting the knight, so that the bishop can then come here and attack the rook. The king comes to e7, the rook comes to d1, and the king goes to e8. So he's only got shuffling back and forwards. Bishop comes to g3 and attacks the rook. Rook comes to h5, and the knight comes to... He's willing to swap off these rooks. He's willing for all swap-offs. All swap-offs are going to be good for him, actually. So, and he takes, and the king takes, so that he's still threatening the rook. So that, yeah, his king's in a more active position for the endgame. Bishop comes to d4, and the rook comes to h1. Bishop takes on g5, so of course he takes pawn, and now he's got 3 pawns for his bishop. He's got enough. He might just get away with it, but no, because he plays bishop to g5, f3, h3 even, blocking, attacking the rook on d7. And the pawn comes to f5, and the bishop comes to f4 to attack the rook. Ding plays rook to h5 and then resigns, realizing that he's messed it up anyway. Because he sees that white's... Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, he sees that white's next move will win the situation for him anyway. He's threatening to play pawn takes pawn, and then if he takes pawn, then he takes with queen. Sorry. I'll turn on the analysis. So the threat is bishop takes f5, so that he's threatening the rook. If the pawn takes, so he's threatening to take this pawn. If the pawn takes, then Gukesh takes the rook and he's an exchange up. If Gukesh takes the rook, then if Ding takes the rook, then Gukesh takes the rook on d7, says check, and wins the rook with an in-betweener. So he wins, he's a bishop up, and this move forces off more swaps and gets rid of black's kingside pawns. There's nothing to play on for. And so Gukesh has equalised the match. 1-1 after 3 games. 1 win each after 3 games. So yeah, don't forget to like, share, comment or subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.